There are places you visit expecting peace. Places far enough from the city that the noise disappears, where the air feels cleaner, the nights darker, and the only sounds are wind moving through the trees and distant animals hidden somewhere beyond the hills. For years, I believed I had found one of those places. I was 22 years old in the spring of 2016 when my friend and I decided to return to a remote camping area we had visited several times before. We usually made the trip 2 or 3 times a year whenever we needed a break from work, traffic, and everything that came with living in the city. The campground was located in a mountainous region a few hours away from home. Most people avoided it because of how isolated it was. Once you left the highway, there was only a long dirt road stretching through the forest. The nearest convenience store was dozens of kilometers away, and after passing a small settlement, there was little evidence that anyone actually lived nearby. The road itself split in 2 directions. One path eventually connected back to the highway, passing an old ranger tower along the way. The other ended abruptly in a dead end. Hidden several kilometers beyond that point, almost completely concealed behind thick trees, stood an abandoned cabin. We had never gone inside. Something about it always felt wrong. By the time we arrived that Tuesday afternoon, the sun was already beginning to disappear behind the mountains. Normally we reached the campground around noon, but both of us had work obligations earlier that week and decided to leave later than usual. There were 2 other groups camping closer to the entrance. Families. People laughing around campfires. Children running between vehicles. But we hadn't driven all that way to stay near other people. We wanted silence. Complete silence. So we continued deeper along the dirt road until we found what seemed like the perfect place. It was a small clearing near the edge of a hill overlooking an enormous valley. From there, the entire landscape could be seen bathed in the orange light of sunset. At that moment, I was convinced we had found our new favorite camping spot. If what happened the following night had never taken place, that place probably would have become our regular destination for years to come. Instead, I have spent almost a decade trying to understand who, or what, was watching us from the darkness. We decided not to bother setting up a tent. It was already getting dark, and honestly, sleeping inside the car didn't sound that bad. We gathered some firewood, lit a small campfire, ate dinner while watching the last traces of sunlight disappear beyond the valley, and spent a few hours talking about work, old memories, and plans for future trips. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with us. I stretched out across the back seat with a couple of blankets while my friend reclined in the passenger seat, leaving his window slightly cracked open. The temperature dropped during the night, bringing with it that familiar mountain chill. Within minutes, we were both asleep. The following day was uneventful. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Looking back now, I realize something felt wrong from the moment I woke up. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was more like the uncomfortable certainty that someone was nearby. Watching. Waiting. Every few hours I heard dry leaves being crushed somewhere beyond the trees. Slow footsteps. A branch snapping. A faint rustling just outside my field of vision. Whenever I turned my head, there was nothing there. No animals. No people. Just trees swaying gently in the wind. I mentioned it to my friend once. He shrugged. He hadn't heard anything unusual. Eventually, I convinced myself I was simply paying too much attention to ordinary forest sounds. After all, we had seen deer, wild horses, and countless small animals during previous trips. There was no reason to think this time would be different. Night returned faster than expected, and with it came that same uneasy feeling, as if something had remained hidden among the trees all day long, simply waiting for darkness. By the time it was nearly 1 in the morning, my friend was already asleep again. I couldn't seem to relax. I was lying in the back seat with my legs stretched toward the rear door. The side window near my feet was cracked open slightly, allowing a cold breeze to drift inside. Unable to sleep, I scrolled through social media on my phone. Then I heard it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps. Close enough that they seemed to circle the vehicle. I lowered my phone and whispered toward the front seat. "Did you hear that?" No answer. My friend was completely asleep. I listened for another minute. Nothing. Silence returned. I exhaled slowly. Probably an animal. Curious about the car. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. So I lifted my phone again. And 10 minutes later, the footsteps came back. Only this time, they stopped directly beside my window. I lowered the phone instinctively. For a moment, my eyes struggled to adjust. The bright screen had blinded me to everything beyond the glass, and when I tilted it away, the faint glow from the display reflected against the window near my feet. That was when I saw it. Even now, years later, I can still picture every detail. Two hands were gripping the edge of the partially opened window. They looked human, but there was something terribly wrong with them. The skin appeared pale and rough, covered with scars and patches of dirt. Long, dark fingernails extended from thin fingers that had been pushed several centimeters inside the vehicle. And behind those hands, a face, pressed tightly against the glass. Its breath fogged the window every few seconds. At first, I couldn't make out any features, only the outline of a head. Then the reflection shifted, and I saw the eyes, wide open, motionless, empty. They weren't blinking. They weren't moving, just staring directly at me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even move. People always talk about the instinct to fight or flee, but no one tells you about the third possibility. Sometimes, your body simply stops. My mind kept repeating the same question over and over. Why aren't you running? Do something. Move. But I remained frozen, watching, waiting, and so was it. Several endless seconds passed between us. Then, without warning, the fingers slowly slid back out through the opening. The hands disappeared. The face vanished into the darkness. A moment later, I heard footsteps retreating toward the trees. Crunch, 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 growing farther away. Only then did my body react. Adrenaline surged through me so violently that I started sweating despite the cold. My heart pounded against my ribs. I struck the back of my friend's seat hard enough to wake him. And before he could even understand what was happening, I kicked open the rear door and jumped outside. Whoever, or whatever, had been standing there, was already gone. I stood there for several seconds, scanning the darkness around the clearing. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No breathing. No figure disappearing between the trees. Only the sound of the wind drifting through the branches. It was as if whatever had been outside the car had never existed at all. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it had been real. Without wasting another second, I began grabbing everything we had left outside. The cooler, the folding chairs, the lantern, the bags. I shoved whatever I could into the back seat and crammed the rest into the trunk, barely paying attention to what I was doing. I just wanted to leave, as quickly as possible. Then I slammed the rear door shut. And that's when I noticed something I somehow hadn't seen before. 2 handprints, pressed against the glass. Dark, wet, smeared across the window exactly where those fingers had been moments earlier. For a second, I simply stared at them. My stomach twisted. I didn't want proof. I wanted to convince myself that I had imagined everything, that exhaustion had distorted my vision, that my mind had turned an animal into something monstrous. But those marks were there, and they looked disturbingly similar to dried blood. Panicking, I wiped them away immediately with my sleeve, almost instinctively, as if erasing the stains would somehow erase the memory itself. By then, my friend was fully awake. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and gripped the steering wheel so tightly my hands hurt. "We have to go." "What?" "There's someone out there." I didn't wait for another question. I pressed the accelerator and sped down the dirt road, bouncing over rocks and potholes while my friend repeatedly told me to slow down. Only after reaching the highway did I finally ease off the gas. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Eventually, about 20 miles away, we stopped at a fast food restaurant. Only then, sitting beneath bright fluorescent lights, surrounded by ordinary people eating breakfast, did I finally tell him what I had seen. But even today, nearly 10 years later, I still don't know who was outside that car. A prankster, a drifter living in the abandoned cabin, a murderer wandering through the forest, or something that had no business being there at all. I have returned to that campground several times since then, but never again far from the highway. And whatever I encountered that night, I can only hope it was the first, and the last time I ever see it. There are countless legends surrounding Germany's Black Forest. Stories about spirits wandering between ancient trees, small beings hiding beneath roots, hunters who disappeared without leaving behind so much as a footprint. Growing up near the forest, I heard all of them, and like most people, I dismissed them as old folktales created to entertain children or explain things our ancestors couldn't understand. At least, that's what I believed until the autumn of 2019. My name isn't important. What matters is that I have spent most of my adult life exploring remote places. I work as a freelance nature photographer, supplying images for travel magazines, hiking publications, and tourism companies. Honestly, it's a dream job. Most days I find myself walking through some of the most beautiful landscapes in Europe with nothing but a backpack, a camera, and complete freedom. The Black Forest has always been one of my favorite places. There is something mesmerizing about it. The towering pines, the thick fog clinging to the ground, the silence that settles over everything once you leave the main trails behind. To me, that strange atmosphere was comforting. I never imagined it could become terrifying. A hiking magazine hired me to photograph several lesser-known trails hidden deep within the forest. They wanted an article showcasing paths experienced hikers rarely visited. I was excited. It meant exploring places I had never seen before. Originally, my friend Marcus was supposed to come with me, but the night before departure, he called. "Sorry," he said. "My son came down with the flu. I can't leave." I assured him I would be fine. It was only supposed to be a 3-day trip. I planned to stay in a series of small mountain shelters scattered along the route and return before the weekend. So early on a Tuesday morning, near the end of October, I packed my equipment and headed toward the forest alone. A thin layer of mist still covered the city as I drove away. By noon, I had already reached the trailhead. The first day was almost perfect. I hiked nearly 20 kilometers through paths so overgrown they occasionally vanished beneath fallen leaves and tangled vegetation. The colors of autumn were incredible. Deep reds, golden beeches, dark green pines standing against a gray sky. I even managed to capture several excellent photographs near a waterfall swollen by recent rain. As evening approached, I finally arrived at the first shelter. It was simple but comfortable enough. A few bunk beds, a tiny cooking area, and most importantly, a roof over my head. Outside, the wind had started to pick up. I was preparing to sleep when I heard something echoing through the trees. A long, low, unnatural howl. And immediately, Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I know what you're probably thinking. A wolf. And honestly, that was my first thought as well. Wolves have slowly been returning to parts of Germany over the last several years. Hearing one in the Black Forest wasn't impossible. But there was one problem. In all my years hiking through those mountains, I had never heard anything like that sound. It wasn't just the pitch. It wasn't the volume. There was something else hidden inside it. Something that felt wrong. The howl carried a strange resonance, almost as if two different voices were layered together. Part animal, part something disturbingly human. I sat there in silence, listening. The wind continued rattling the wooden walls of the shelter. Branches scraped against the roof. And then, the howl came again. Closer this time. Much closer. A chill slid down my spine. For the first time in years, I found myself checking whether a door was locked. I made sure every window was secured and climbed into my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself that exhaustion was making me paranoid. After all, I had spent countless nights alone in forests much more remote than this. Nothing had ever happened. Eventually, sleep won, and when I opened my eyes again, sunlight was streaming through the shelter windows. Birds chirped outside. The forest looked peaceful, normal. Embarrassed by how frightened I had been, I laughed at myself. Maybe I had simply let old childhood stories get into my head. I packed my gear and continued deeper into the forest. But as the hours passed, a new feeling began to replace my earlier fear. It was subtle at first. The sensation you get when someone is staring at you from across a room. Only stronger. Much stronger. Every few minutes, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. There was never anyone there. Only endless trees, dense undergrowth, and shadows stretching farther than they should. Once, I could have sworn I saw movement at the edge of my vision. Something tall slipping behind a cluster of pines. But when I turned, there was nothing. No footsteps, no animals, no sound at all. By late afternoon, I was seriously considering cutting the trip short. The feeling of being watched hadn't disappeared. It had grown. And now I was hearing things. Branches snapping somewhere behind me. Leaves rustling just outside my line of sight. Always close enough to notice. Never close enough to see. I checked my phone, hoping to call Marcus. Or even contact a local ranger. No signal. Of course. By the time I reached the second shelter, the sun was already disappearing behind the mountains. And that was when I heard water moving nearby. A stream. Only 20 meters away. I looked toward it. And what I saw standing there still doesn't seem possible to me. At first, I thought it was a person. A very tall man standing motionless in the shallow water. But the longer I looked, the more I realized something was terribly wrong. It wasn't human. Not even close. Its body was massive, broad-shouldered, and heavily built, easily taller than any man I had ever seen. Thick, dark fur covered its entire frame, moving slightly with the cold evening breeze. Its arms hung unnaturally low. Its posture was upright, balanced on two legs. And then I saw its face. It was elongated, almost like the muzzle of a wolf. Rows of sharp teeth protruded from partially opened jaws. But what truly froze me in place were its eyes. Amber, bright, reflecting the last traces of daylight, locked directly onto mine. For several seconds, neither of us moved. I don't remember breathing. I don't remember blinking. I only remember staring back at it, trying desperately to convince myself that there had to be a rational explanation. A large dog. A bear suffering from some deformity. A trick of the fading light. Anything. Anything except what my mind was telling me. Then it slowly tilted its head upward and opened its mouth. The sound that came out was the exact same howl I had heard the previous night. Long, deep, and carrying that strange human quality hidden beneath it. That was enough. I turned and ran. I wish I could tell you I stayed calm, that I took photographs, that I acted like a professional wildlife photographer. But I didn't. Pure panic took over. I abandoned my backpack without even realizing it. I stumbled over roots, slid down muddy slopes, fell against rocks. Branches scratched my face and arms as I pushed blindly through the forest. My lungs burned. My legs felt ready to collapse. And behind me, I thought I could hear something. Heavy footsteps, branches snapping, something large moving through the trees. Maybe it was only fear. Maybe my imagination was filling the silence. Or maybe something really was chasing me. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the dense woods opened up onto one of the main hiking trails. There were people there. A few hikers. Ordinary people. And seeing them was the greatest relief I had ever felt. Because for the first time since entering the forest, I no longer felt alone. I must have looked completely insane. Sweating. Covered in mud. Breathing so hard I could barely speak. One of the hikers stepped toward me. "Hey, are you okay?" I pointed back toward the trees. "A wolf," I managed to say. There's something in there." The hikers exchanged confused looks. "A wolf?" one of them asked skeptically. "Maybe a dog. There's a small village not far from here." I shook my head immediately. No, it wasn't a dog. It wasn't even an animal. Eventually, they agreed to walk back a short distance with me, more out of concern for my mental state than because they believed my story. We searched the edge of the trail. Nothing. No tracks. No broken branches. No strange sounds. No glowing amber eyes staring from between the trees. After several minutes, one of the men turned toward me. "There's nothing here, friend. Are you sure you're okay? Do you need us to call someone?" At that point, I probably did look like a man having a breakdown. And honestly, I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. They offered to drive me back to Freiburg, assuming I had suffered some kind of panic attack. I accepted. I didn't argue, because I didn't know what else I could possibly say. It took me several days before I found the courage to return for my equipment. This time, Marcus came with me. We went back in broad daylight, and my backpack was exactly where I had dropped it. Untouched. The camera was still inside. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been disturbed. Marcus looked at me while we walked back toward the parking area. "Are you sure you didn't scare yourself?" he asked. "You know how creepy these forests can feel when you're alone." I nodded, but I didn't answer, because deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear myself say it out loud. I still live near the Black Forest. I still work as a photographer, but I never returned to those remote trails. Not once. And even now, years later, I make sure my doors and windows are locked every night. Part of me hopes it was only exhaustion, a trick of the fading light. Shadows twisting into impossible shapes. A mind influenced by old legends and too many hours spent alone in the wilderness. But another part of me remembers those eyes. Amber, unblinking, watching me from the stream. And sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees outside my house, I can almost hear that howl again. Long, low, and far too human to belong to any wolf. I hope you'll allow me to share my family's story. It is the story of how everything we once believed about our home, our faith, and even our own blood slowly began to fall apart. When I was a child, our family consisted of my parents, my 3 older sisters, Angeles, Sarah, and Carla, and me, the youngest of all. My father was rarely home. He was obsessed with work and spent nearly all of his time away from us. Thankfully, my mother was always there. She filled our house with warmth, kindness, and affection, making sure we grew up in a loving environment despite my father's constant absence. The only conflict that seemed impossible to avoid involved my 2 oldest sisters, Angeles and Sarah. Since childhood, they competed for our father's attention and often argued about who was his favorite. Those disagreements slowly pushed them away from each other, while Carla and I became increasingly close. As we grew older, our lives followed very different paths. Sarah was the first to leave home. She dropped out of school, married young, and eventually had 3 children. Not long afterward, Angeles also became pregnant at 20 and got married. Suddenly, only Carla and I remained living with our parents. As strange as it may sound, those were probably the happiest years of our lives. The house felt peaceful. There were no arguments, no tension. Only the 4 of us sharing dinners, helping each other with school, and enjoying the quiet routine of everyday life. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. Carla and I returned home from school and found Sarah standing in the living room beside several suitcases. Her children sat silently on the couch while my mother tried to comfort her. Apparently, she had problems with her mother-in-law, with whom she had been living. A few days later, her husband Daniel arrived carrying his own luggage. Whenever we asked what had happened, neither of them wanted to explain. My father suspected they would be staying with us for quite some time, so he made an effort to build a small room above the garage. It had its own entrance, accessible through a narrow metal staircase that rose from the driveway, giving them some privacy. At first, everything seemed normal. Then Sarah began inviting a woman to our house almost every day. No one trusted her. People in the neighborhood whispered that her mother had once been expelled from her community after being accused of practicing witchcraft. I never knew if those rumors were true. But after that woman entered our lives, something inside my sister began to change. At first, the changes were subtle. Sarah stopped spending time with us and rarely joined family meals anymore. She became distant, quiet, and strangely secretive. Most days, she only left the house to take her children to school and buy groceries. The rest of her time was spent alone in the room above the garage. Then something happened that none of us could ignore. One weekend, my parents, Carla, and I traveled to visit relatives for a few days, leaving Sarah behind to watch the house. When we returned, we found traces of melted wax scattered across the backyard. Near the center of the garden was a large circle made entirely of burned candles. No one asked questions. No one wanted answers. Deep down, we all sensed that something strange had happened while we were away. As weeks passed, Sarah grew increasingly withdrawn. She barely spoke to anyone. She no longer laughed. She avoided eye contact. Sometimes, I would hear her walking back and forth upstairs late into the night, whispering words I couldn't understand. The atmosphere inside our home slowly became heavier, more oppressive, as if an invisible weight had settled over the house. The worst incident occurred during the birthday party of Sarah's oldest son. For the occasion, Angeles came over with her children. At first, everything seemed pleasant. People were eating, talking, and watching the children play. But as always, the old rivalry between my sisters resurfaced. A small disagreement quickly turned into shouting. Then Angeles suddenly accused Sarah of practicing witchcraft. She begged her to stop before she reached a point of no return. The entire room fell silent. Sarah's expression changed immediately. Her face turned red. Her eyes filled with hatred. and with a voice trembling with rage, she said something none of us have ever forgotten. "You will pay for this. I will hurt you where it hurts the most." My parents quickly took Angelus and her children home and returned without saying a word. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Sarah's face. It wasn't simply anger. There was something else behind her eyes. Something cold. Something hostile. Months passed, and we tried to convince ourselves that it had only been another argument between sisters. Until one night, we heard loud footsteps coming from Sarah's room upstairs. Back and forth. Back and forth. For nearly an hour. She seemed to be speaking loudly, almost chanting. Finally, my mother gathered enough courage to go upstairs and see what was happening. A few minutes later, she came back down. She looked pale, terrified. Then she whispered something that sent chills down all our spines. Sarah had been kneeling on the floor, praying to a figure nearly the size of a human being. None of us dared to ask what the figure looked like, and my mother never volunteered any more details. Perhaps she was too frightened to describe it, or perhaps she feared that giving shape to what she had seen would somehow make it more real. After that night, an uncomfortable silence settled over our home. We avoided talking about Sarah. We avoided looking toward the metal staircase that led to her room. And whenever footsteps echoed from upstairs late at night, we simply pretended not to hear them. The only good news during those dark months came from Carla. One evening, she gathered us in the living room and announced that she was pregnant. For the first time in a long while, everyone smiled. My parents were overjoyed. Another grandchild was on the way. We celebrated together, laughing and making plans for the future. But the happiness didn't last long. The very next day, Sarah came downstairs and calmly said that she already knew Carla was expecting a baby. No one had told her. She looked directly at my sister and spoke in a strangely detached tone. "She should be careful. She is going to have many problems." Those words filled us with unease. It felt less like a warning, and more like a threat. That night, Carla asked me to stay in her room until she fell asleep. She admitted that Sarah's behavior had been frightening her. I agreed. We watched television for a while and talked about old memories from our childhood. Eventually, Carla drifted off to sleep. At some point, I fell asleep as well. Then I felt something. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sensation was too vivid, too real. Cold hands slowly slid across my back. Then they wrapped around my neck. I tried to move. I tried to scream. But my body refused to obey me. I couldn't even open my mouth. Then a voice whispered close to my ear. "Your sister is not going to wake up." Panic overwhelmed me. I fought desperately against whatever held me down. I wanted to warn Carla. I wanted to pull those hands away from my throat. But I couldn't move a single muscle. Suddenly, the bedroom door burst open. My mother stood there, visibly shaken. She had come to wake us because Sarah was outside, standing near a tree in the front yard, praying, and staring up into its branches. We managed to convince my mother to bring her back upstairs. But by then, the fear we felt toward Sarah had already become overwhelming. And in the days that followed, the strange events inside our house only became more frequent. The days passed, and our home no longer felt like the place where we had grown up. Something had changed. Something we couldn't explain. My father began complaining that he could no longer sleep. Almost every night, he said he saw his deceased mother standing beside his bed. She never spoke much. She simply looked at him with sadness and warned him that he was in danger. At first, my mother dismissed these experiences as stress. She refused to believe that anything supernatural could be happening inside our house. But eventually, even she began to doubt herself. One afternoon, Sarah's youngest son innocently revealed that his mother often gathered her children in her room upstairs and made them pray with her. When my mother asked who they were praying to, the boy lowered his head. Then he quietly answered, "Someone." He never said another word. Fortunately, Carla eventually moved into an apartment with her fiancé. She was pregnant, emotionally exhausted, and desperately needed to get away from the tension surrounding Sarah. For a while, we believed she was finally safe. Then one night, the phone rang. It was Carla. She was crying, terrified. She told us that Sarah had been standing outside her apartment building, praying, murmuring words she couldn't understand. Just standing there, looking toward her window. My father and I drove there as quickly as we could. But by the time we arrived, Sarah was gone. When we returned home, my mother informed us that she had already come back. She was sitting alone in the living room, laughing, not smiling, laughing uncontrollably, as if she had just heard the funniest joke in the world. From that point on, strange events became almost routine. I started waking up with scratches on my arms and chest. My parents claimed that the television turned on by itself during the middle of the night. Sometimes, someone knocked on the front door after midnight. Whenever we rushed outside to check, there was never anyone there. And then misfortune seemed to attach itself to me personally. My car began breaking down constantly. Every week, something else failed. A dead battery, a damaged alternator, flat tires, electrical problems. I borrowed money from my father several times to pay for repairs. Eventually, I gave up. I parked the car in the garage and simply left it there. Desperate, my mother finally sought help. One of her closest friends was a deeply religious woman. After hearing everything, she contacted a Catholic priest and asked him to bless our house. None of us imagined that even he would leave looking disturbed. The priest arrived on a quiet afternoon carrying 2 bottles of holy water. He greeted us warmly and listened patiently as my mother explained everything that had been happening inside the house. Without hesitation, he uncapped the first bottle. The moment he did, an unbearable odor filled the room. It smelled exactly like sewage. Rotten. Putrid. The priest frowned in confusion. Assuming the bottle had somehow been contaminated, he opened the second one. The smell that escaped was even worse. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Even the priest seemed unsettled. Unable to use either bottle, he went to the kitchen, filled a glass container with tap water, blessed it himself, and began sprinkling it throughout the house. As he moved from room to room, he prayed continuously. Before leaving, he gave us a simple piece of advice. Attend church. Pray together. Do not abandon your faith. Seek refuge in God. Surprisingly, things seemed to calm down after that. The atmosphere inside the house felt lighter. The noises upstairs stopped. No one heard footsteps anymore. And for the first time in months, we slept peacefully. Then Sarah came downstairs one morning and announced that she was moving away. At first, we were relieved. Until she told us where she was going. She had rented a house very close to Angelus. Fear returned immediately. The relationship between my sisters had never recovered after that terrible argument. Now, they openly hated each other. And whatever had happened to Sarah, whatever had changed her, made us fear for Angelus and her children. Soon enough, Angelus called us. She said she had started seeing Sarah outside her house late at night, standing near the sidewalk, whispering, murmuring the same words over and over again, watching the house, waiting. Weeks passed. Then we received a phone call. The worst phone call our family had ever received. Angelus's oldest son had been involved in a tragic accident while leaving school. He didn't survive. The entire family was devastated. At the funeral, while everyone mourned, one of Sarah's children quietly approached us. He looked frightened, as if he knew he shouldn't be saying what he was about to say. Then he whispered something that still haunts me to this day. "My mother used to offer my cousin to someone." He paused, then lowered his head. "To something." None of us knew what to say, and none of us dared repeat those words to Angelus. We decided to keep that secret to ourselves. Angelus was already drowning in grief, and telling her what her nephew had confessed would only deepen the wounds she was desperately trying to survive. 4 months, our entire family focused on helping her recover. Slowly, she managed to overcome the worst of her depression. She returned to work, spent more time with her children, and little by little, she began rebuilding her life. Strangely enough, during that same period, Sarah seemed to be thriving. Her mood improved. She looked healthier, more energetic. Her husband received a promotion at work, and not long afterward, they moved to another state. With time, contact between Sarah and the rest of the family almost completely disappeared. At first, we felt guilty for being relieved. After all, she was still our daughter, our sister, our blood. But the truth is that life became peaceful again. The strange noises stopped. No one woke up with scratches anymore. The television remained silent during the night. No one knocked at our door after midnight. And for the first time in years, our house finally felt like home again. 7 years have passed since then. The fear we once felt slowly faded into distant memories. But it never disappeared completely. Even today, there is still a part of me that worries. A part of me that wonders what would happen if Sarah suddenly returned. If one day she appeared at our front door. If she tried to become part of our lives again. Sometimes I ask myself whether she was truly involved with something dark. Whether she had lost her mind. Whether she was manipulated by someone who took advantage of her vulnerability. Or whether all of us, trapped inside a house consumed by fear, simply interpreted ordinary tragedies as something supernatural. I honestly don't know, and perhaps I never will. What I do know is that I still remember the hatred I saw in her eyes. I still remember my mother describing that human-sized figure hidden in her room. I still remember waking up unable to move, feeling cold hands wrapped around my neck. And I still remember the words spoken by her own son during the funeral. She offered him to something. 7 years have passed, but one fear remains within our family. The fear that Sarah might come back. That she might once again try to get close to us. And in God's name, for everyone's sake, I pray that never happens. But if it does, I only hope she has become a renewed person. What do you think really happened to Sarah? Was she involved with something dark? Was she suffering from a mental illness? Or was an entire family slowly consumed by fear and superstition? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy true horror stories, supernatural encounters, and unexplained mysteries, don't forget to subscribe to the Horror Log. There are many more stories waiting in the dark.